No one really likes to think about the United States as being an empire. But late 1800s, they got into the ballgame. Welcome to freaking history. If you want a 3, a 4, or 5 on your APUSH, AP World, or AP Euro exam, I'm the guy to see. Now, to give some context, for about 100 years, 1800 to almost 1900, the United States was building itself from the idea of Jefferson, and there were going to be a lot of agriculturally based citizens and continuing to work small farms and democracy working at a local level. But then with market revolution to the Civil War into industrialization, the United States took off and became a major economic power and producer in the world. And when you produce, you need natural resources and new markets. The United States looked at both. Now, we've talked about Alaska already being in play in the 1860s. However, let's get to the Spanish-American War. So today, in American history, we are going to be talking about the causes and effects of the Spanish-American War. If we're talking about causes, a couple of main ones. The first one is going to be yellow journalism. And again, you guys, I'm telling you, man, every time I talk about this late 1890s, it so reminds me of today. With yellow journalism, 2 names you want to know. You want to know William Hearst, and you want to know Joseph Pulitzer. They ran newspapers, and they were looking for salacious headlines to be able to draw in people. And what was the purpose of that but to get you to read papers? When you think about it, it's kind of like clickbait that you see on social media, getting you to click to read the story. And what did they do it for? To sell advertising. It's kind of the same difference. Now, the next cause was the explosion and that led to the destruction of the USS Maine. Now, the USS Maine was down in Havana. It was making a stance against the Spanish who were holding Cuba at the time, and the atrocities that were being said that were happening on the island to the natives. But with that explosion, there wasn't a whole lot of investigation from that yellow journalism group. They wanted that war. They helped the United States get that war. Headlines flashing, 256 dead. Again, getting the American people behind the idea of going to war with Spain. In other words, remember the Maine, to hell with Spain. Now, the war itself, you don't really need to know a lot of it. It's a very short war that took place basically in Cuba and then also in the Philippines. We'll get to that in a second. Filipino. After this short war, there were a few concessions, and which are the effects that ended up in the hands of the Americans. And let's first start with the Philippines. American ships were sent over to Manila and eventually, very quickly, took control of the Philippines, which was during the war. Again, this was probably about a 6-week war total. And so while things were wrapping up in Cuba, the United States takes control of the Philippines, and Spain is ready to concede. Here's what they conceded. The Philippines, for $20 million, went to the hands of the United States. Cuba was independent. However, the United States kept their little hand in the cookie jar with the Platt Amendment. You're going to need to know that, which basically wrote into the Cuban Constitution that the United States, if they were economically being challenged in Cuba, that the Americans could step in. Third, very interestingly enough, Puerto Rico becomes a U.S. territory. And the other big piece was in the Pacific, Guam. Let me tell you why that's important. With the acquisition of the Philippines and the annexation of Hawaii over the ability to be able to control the sugar market, Guam is another place out in the Pacific that we're building this little Western empire to ensure ourselves to get into those Asian markets. And where do we want to get into with those Asian markets? China. Yes, John Hay went over and was saying, sent a letter to all of those spheres of influence, England, France, Russia, etc., saying, hey, China should be open door policy. Keep the door open for everybody to walk through and trade. Europeans didn't embrace it, but they didn't reject it either. So if it's not a no, it's a yes. And there you have the Americans' imperialistic motives. They were not a part of the scramble of Africa, but they were building their own little empire in the Caribbean, also in the Pacific. Now you know your freaking history. Peace.